Hi, welcome back to the channel. In this episode, I want to provide you with an update as to what's happening in the relationship between the USA and India and why this spells seriously bad news, not just for Russia, but also for the BRICS alliance. Now, if you've been following the channel, you'll know that Donald Trump has been targeting India. He's actually increased the tariff to 50% on all Indian exports into the US market as a result of the fact that India is continuing to buy Russian oil. He has told India that they need to stop those purchases. And up until this point, India was continuing to make all of those deals. However, it's now been announced that India has agreed to cut back, in fact, to stop buying Russian oil. And as a result of that, Donald Trump has changed the tariffs. So let's have a look at the post on Truth Social, which is the go to site for Donald Trump to announce anything these days. It says, "It was an honor to speak with Prime Minister Modi of India this morning. He is one of my greatest friends and a powerful and respected leader of his country. We spoke about many things, including trade and ending the war with Russia and Ukraine. He agreed to stop buying Russian oil and to buy much more from the United States and potentially Venezuela. This will help end the war in Ukraine, which is taking place right now with thousands of people dying each and every week. Out of friendship and respect for Prime Minister Modi, and as per his request, effective immediately, we agreed to a trade deal between the United States and India, whereby the United States will charge a reduced reciprocal tariff, lowering it from 25% to 18%. They will likewise move forward to reduce their tariffs and non tariff barriers against the United States to zero. The Prime Minister also committed to buy American at a much higher level, in addition to over $500 billion of US energy, technology, agricultural, coal, and many other products. Our amazing relationship with India will be even stronger going forward. Prime Minister Modi and I are two people that get things done, something that cannot be said for most. Thank you for your attention on this matter." Now, I think there are a few interesting points that were made in that announcement. Firstly, Donald Trump was linking the discussions to what's happening in Ukraine. So he specifically named Russia as something that he's trying to sort out. That was right at the front end of that announcement. So he's basically saying that this is part and parcel of bringing peace to Ukraine. And the reason why he's saying that is because Russia will not be able to survive if it can't continue selling oil to India. It's just not going to be possible for the Russian oil industry to keep producing the amount of oil that it's currently pumping out if it doesn't have anybody to sell it to. And India has been taking around 2 million barrels of oil per day. Russia's producing around 10 million barrels, and 20% of that is going directly to India. Now, if India does stop purchasing, which is what it's agreed to do, then what's Russia going to do? Because it's impossible for Russia to be able to store that amount of oil. So it will have to cut back on its production. And as we've talked about many times before, that's going to be catastrophic for the Russian oil industry because you can't just turn the tap on and off when you want to, when you're talking about taking oil out of the ground in frozen areas of the world. And one of the other things that Donald Trump specifically stipulated in that announcement is that India will now consider taking oil from Venezuela. So this is basically pulling together all of the aspects of what Donald Trump has been doing over the past few months. He recently replaced Nicolas Maduro as the head of Venezuela, so he was removed physically by force. And so that's opened up Venezuelan oil to American oil companies, and they're now looking to place that oil into India. So this is all pulling together in terms of the global supply of oil, replacing Russia with Venezuelan oil, which, let's not forget, was previously sanctioned before the military action in Venezuela. Now, just before we go any further today, could I ask anybody that hasn't subscribed yet to please hit that subscribe button? My numbers have been going down, so I'd genuinely appreciate it if you could help me out and hit that red button. Also, I'd like to remind you that I'm currently running a competition whereby you can win my property located close to one of the best beaches in the UK or £250,000 in cash. But I need your support in order to get that competition over the line. So have a look at the QR code on the screen now or click the link in the description below. Really appreciate your support. Now, in response to Donald Trump's announcement, Prime Minister Modi of India posted this on X, which says, "Wonderful to speak with my dear friend President Trump today. Delighted that made in India products will now have a reduced tariff of 18%. Big thanks to President Trump on behalf of the 1.4 billion people of India for this wonderful announcement." When two large economies and the world's largest democracies work together, it benefits our people and unlocks immense opportunities for mutually beneficial cooperation. President Trump's leadership is vital for global peace, stability, and prosperity. India fully supports his efforts for peace. I look forward to working closely with him to take our partnership to unprecedented heights. Now, there's a few really interesting points that have been made here by Prime Minister Modi. Firstly, he's mentioned the 1.4 billion people in India. And obviously, he has to look after all of those interests, not just what's going on economically, but also making sure that there's enough employment for everybody. And I'll go on to talk about what the impact of the relationship between India and Russia is, and India and the USA in terms of employment. And there is a huge difference in terms of those two economies. And you can guess which one is more beneficial to India by the tone of this announcement. But interestingly, he's also talking about India and the USA working closely together. He's talking about democracies. And I think this is interesting when you look at the context of BRICS, because the BRICS relationship between the biggest players in BRICS are Russia, China, and India. So when you're talking about Russia and China, they're not really genuine democracies. They do have votes. They vote for who the leader is going to be. But realistically, they're not true democracies. We've seen the same leader keeping power in both of those countries for a long period of time, and there's really only one choice when it comes to voting. So I think what we're seeing here is India leaning into that democratic relationship and getting closer to the USA, and that spells serious trouble for the BRICS alliance. In terms of looking at the economics of this situation, in the 12 months ending November 25, India exported $102.8 billion worth of goods into the US market, and USA exported $45.2 billion worth of goods into India. So that represents a trade deficit of around $58 billion from the USA's point of view. But that's always going to be the situation because you've got India, which is a very low cost economy in terms of its labor rates. And so it makes sense for things that are using a lot of labor to be made in countries like India. The USA is never going to be exporting more goods to India than it's importing because it just doesn't make sense from a cost point of view. And if we look at what sort of things India is exporting to the USA, we're talking about electronics and electrical equipment, which are quite labor intensive in terms of actually putting them together, pharmaceuticals, and that's generic pharmaceuticals because it's basically cheaper to make those drugs in India than it is elsewhere in the world. Gems and jewelry, because again, it's labor intensive and India does have those raw materials. Machinery and engineering goods, textiles and apparel, so clothing and chemicals. So they're very important industries from India's point of view. Now, if we do a calculation, the World Trade Organization's guideline in terms of how many jobs are created per value of export is that they estimate that one job equates to around $100,000 worth of exports. So when you're talking about $103 billion worth of exports over the past 12 months, India are looking at around 1.1 million people being employed in all of those different businesses that are exporting to the USA. If we now look at the relationship between India and Russia in terms of how much India is exporting to Russia, it's around about $5 billion. So that's 20 times smaller than the exports going to the USA. And in terms of employment, we're talking around 50,000 people. So, from Prime Minister Modi's point of view, he's looking at the two relationships, the one with the USA and the one with Russia, and deciding which is more important to the Indian economy. And clearly, from an employment point of view, the USA is massive, over 1 million people employed directly relating to goods going to the US. In terms of Russia, it's lost in the roundings. And obviously, from a GDP and economic point of view, the USA is clearly far more important. It represents around about 20% of all of India's exports. So, this is the bottom line as to why India has now agreed to stop buying Russian oil, because that oil can be purchased elsewhere. Oil is freely available. You can buy it from any country that's producing oil. India doesn't have to buy Russian oil. And in fact, before the war in Ukraine started, India didn't buy any because it was just too expensive to export it all the way from Russia to India on all of those ships. It started buying it because Russia was offering huge discounts. And so economically, that made sense from Prime Minister Modi's point of view because he could buy a cheap raw material. However, the impact of the tariffs from the USA has started to hurt the Indian economy. And obviously, he wants to grow the relationship and to build the level of exports and to start expanding. And so he's made that decision that the USA is far more important to India than Russia is. And so he's walking away from buying Russian oil. And interestingly, from Russia's point of view, China is now also considering doing the same thing as a result of the ramping up of the sanctions. We've talked about this many times before, but the two biggest oil producers in Russia have now been hit with direct sanctions. That's Rosneft and Lukoil. And as a result of that, Chinese companies are now pulling back from making those deals because they're also facing the risk of secondary sanctions. So what we're seeing here is that Russia is losing its two biggest customers. That's going to be absolutely devastating for both the Russian economy and also the Russian oil industry. This could really kill off a lot of those production facilities in Russia if they're having to cut back on the amount of oil that they're producing. But also, and I think more importantly in terms of the context of this video, this could be a hammer blow for the BRICS alliance. Now, the BRICS alliance has been going for a long time and it hasn't really got going in terms of the level of trade between all of the different parties involved. They do have a meeting once a year and everybody talks about how they're going to build a strong alliance that's going to cut out all of the West. However, we haven't seen any evidence of that. And what we're seeing in terms of the announcements that have come out over the past couple of days is that the BRICS alliance now looks to be on very shaky ground, because if India is pulling back from its relationship with Russia and China starts to do the same, then basically BRICS is finished. It just won't have any coherence and it won't be able to move forward because its three biggest members are effectively pulling back from dealing with each other. So the overall summary of today's video is that the announcement that India has agreed to stop purchasing Russian oil in order to get a preferential trade deal with the USA to reduce that tariff to 18% tells us, firstly, that India has decided that it wants to get closer to the US and the West. Secondly, it tells us that India is pulling back from Russian oil purchasing, which is going to be very damaging economically for Russia. But also it could have catastrophic implications for the Russian oil industry, particularly when you take into account the fact that China is also pulling back on its purchases of Russian oil. And all of this spells serious bad news, not just for Russia, but also for the BRICS alliance. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative, and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already. I'm trying to increase my subscriber numbers. They're going down at the moment, so if you could help out, that would be great. Also, don't forget that I'm currently running my competition whereby you can win my house located close to one of the best beaches in the UK or £250,000. This is another way of funding the channel, so please get involved. If you can, scan the QR code on the screen now or click the link in the description below. Thank you so much to everyone that's supporting me in other ways. If you've bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks, I really appreciate that generosity. Thank you so much. And if you've signed up as either a YouTube member or a patron, I also appreciate that long-term support, helps to keep me motivated. And here's something to put a smile on your face.